it is a good thing to at least devote 1/3 of your day to not just the concept, but the practice of spiritual vitality. Absolutely mental health. Now, you can do this while working, but of course, it's optimal if you can find some solitary space that isn't annoying you in some way. Because if you look at yourself as like a bear, some type of animal with complete neutrality, a bear that has been in a shaking cage, like on a railway trip across country, got shaken up like that for a long period of time, that bear needs time to decompress in a natural environment. That bear is going to be screwy for some time until he adapts back to his natural habitat. Now, there's no reason to over dramatize that whole process. The bear is not defective, okay? The bear is also not stuck or doomed to be stuck in a rattling cage. And the bear has to take it upon himself to lick its wounds and to cool down, to cool itself down. Now, if the bear knew about concepts like fatalism, they could help themselves out, but here's the other thing, bears are more spontaneity. They have more spontaneity, more naturalness, more authenticity. They don't get into the same type of problems that human beings get into, overthinking their importance to the planet. Putting too much extras on things, that's what big self is all about, right? Vanity, also greed. Why should they have it? I want it, right? That's, you have those types of thoughts, those types of cravings, which are sometimes normal, but you scale them, then you start seeing negative social dimensions and dynamics start taking place. And you can see it on an abstract level. That's really cool. That's sort of what our telescopic type of information space can allow us to see as scientists on an abstract level. But we can also take those abstract observations and apply them to our personal lives for the sake of the well-being and harmony of everyone you come in contact with, including yourself. That's sort of what you come into contact with again and again and again in a repetitive type nature, which is either really irritating and annoying if you keep like a bear going through the thorn bushes instead of taking the little nice grassy walkway where the raspberries are always ripe and there's not barking dogs or hunters or cliffs or anything else that can mess you up. But then there's the river down there, which is pretty nice, has some nice fish, and then there's a whole nice country. Bears aren't as sedentary as many humans are. I mean, humans, how they live today, which is what is considered modern, which is really actually a regression, is very limited compared to how our ancestors lived. Let's just say hunters and gatherers. We look down on them like, oh, they had to do that. That that wasn't really a chore for them. It was how they lived, and it was a lot more dynamic. They were not stuck in a box with a number on it and a contract that requires a payment or eviction. They weren't in places like caves like that They were wandering with the antelope, wandering with the herds, or not. Maybe they had more of an agrarian thing going on. They had domesticated livestock, which meant they had grain, and grain became more sedentary. And from that model, they developed the more urbanized spaces, higher populations, but of course that requires a lot of moving parts, and things can go wrong. They can go wrong, they do go wrong, they did go wrong, and now we're in a gray area. You can get people that have very few principles and very few scruples and very little care about what comes after them, and can get very sold on very illusory, misleading ideas that can lead to a general breakdown or dysfunction or who knows what. For example, imagine for a time a border between two countries, one country just sends all types of bandits over the border. And for a while, that seemed like a smart strategy because there was nothing coming back. There was no downsides for the bandits. But one day they messed up so many people that it became a public issue, and the other side organized and brought down hellfire on them all. So they were expecting a lifelong rook, and they end up getting rooked themselves. And they thought it would last 30 years, it only lasted 3. Something like that. These are people that overestimate themselves and do bad things to get ahead in life. That's what they are presented with that option. They take that option and they feel like they've made the right decision for themselves, and they're not questioning themselves. So, and they're not stopping themselves. Now they can be stopped. It really depends on who's doing what, where, and with what. Most likely they can be stopped, but is it practically feasible or not? A place like Somalia, who's doing what there? If you're a peasant, you're a good person, what is the best way to live? It's probably not mixing it up in high density population zones. Maybe not. Maybe it's a hybrid. People are surviving there to this day. It's just not considered to be a good way to survive. But most likely some are surviving better than others. And so that's what things revert to when security systems get compromised. And the assumption of security isn't security, so people in the West assume they have security that they don't have. Now, is that a situation that is an anomaly? Is it the end of the line, or will there be some countercurrents that the Lord only knows, right? Nobody can tell. But what I do know is the world is a really big place, so we get caught up. We like to get caught up in our own little things, and sometimes we join into the kerfuffles of other people and live vicariously off that drama. That's really foolish in a lot of ways. That's some type of like dynamic of its own, social dynamic. So, yeah, modern day people need to learn how to unplug for real, and also unplug from people that are plugged into a lot of nonsense or got plugged into a lot of nonsense, and also avoid people plugging people into nonsense type situation. because one thing I do know is that public relations don't turn into good policy or good execution, and the think tanks behind them, a lot of them are screwy. The people paying them are screwy, and the people coming up with whatever slop they come up with is screwy. So, is that good for you? Well, they're trying to signal that it's not good for you, so just don't get involved because this is our business. But what if their business is wrecking everybody else's business? What if they don't care about the real business? They just care about funny business. So, but yeah, people like that, not so easy to change out, like a stinky pair of boxer shorts that have all different types of like rips, stains, worn out in the butt type leadership class. I mean, they are incompetent to the point of massive security breaches that endanger all of our lives. But that doesn't mean they're ready to admit that to themselves or others. So, is it true? Well, if they don't see it, if they're infallible, if they can only make the right decisions because that's how they stay popular, then of course they're right. Make it right. Tell somebody it's right when it's not. The poll numbers sink. Oh, the polls are down. We need to come up with a new fancy story because our fancy stories aren't working enough. Imagine that. Even the fancy story people can't sell the crap you're trying to sell. And what do they revert to? Well, they revert to that they don't care on a very fundamental level. And then we have more carelessness. So the cities, even stupid tyrants, if they have any executive control, will make sure that like cities look presentable. But these people called politicians today, they have people find locations that look presentable, and that's where they go and get their picture taken. They're not interested in solving the real problems. They're just interested in the optics for them. That's it. So it's really a shame that certain cultures can be so degraded by such coincidences, but in the randomness of the world, why couldn't it have turned out that way this time, this century, this year, this day, this month? This is what it looks like. Pretty ridiculous. A lot of people trying to figure out how we got here, but more people should be figuring out how to get someplace else to where this trajectory is heading. Because the way it looks like, if they set it up, that it all gets splattered against like a wall near a drain somewhere, and they don't care. So why should someone have anything against somebody saying that if it's not true? If you're part of the profiteer class, you're going to continue on not caring. That's a given in the face of all this destruction. At this point, people who still don't care, they're never going to care. They have proven they have an infinite level of not caring, not caring about culture, not caring about security, not caring about the economy, not caring about social relations. Just across the board, just absolute zero care. So that is, I think, one of their personal strengths on a certain level. It's just they're in the wrong profession. They shouldn't have gone into. Imagine some hairstylist just doesn't care how you look after. At this, they don't care if you get your hair cut or not. They just want you to pay. Maybe they'll just break the door and put up like a mailbox with a slit or slot and two goons and you pay for the haircut, and you don't get a haircut, and then you go away, and if you don't pay, the goons beat you up. Like, how about that service provider type of relationship, so level as a simile for what we have now? But I like the one that would be very lazy. I mean, of course, that's in some places where the polity has long since died out and been crushed under the tremendous weight of tremendous toads that are really a handful number. Some people said 30 is enough. Could be even less than that. The absolutely most atrophied political system is the system of one, absolute one. There's only one leader allowed, one big opinion, and everyone else has to. It's all politics. What the truth is? The first truth is the the one person allowed to decide politics. That one person gets to say whether or not they're wearing clothes and how they look. So how easy is it for political systems to fall into total delusion and total disrepair? Yes, people and a tyrant. Yes, people surrounded by a tyrant. Or no, a tyrant surrounded by the yes people. That's it. Now that's the degraded form. How about this? Yes, people around a hero. That's a completely different trajectory. That's the way it should work. Unfortunately, it's not the way that it always works. But that is sort of what people, at least Western people, naturally congregate or form themselves into. Which in and of itself isn't perfect, but it is a reality. Now the problem is again, when that power dynamic, a person leads themselves off a cliff with delusion, leads everyone else off a cliff with delusion. You're really putting too much onus on one person. The system has fragility built into it. It also is a gigantic bottleneck. One person has to make all the decisions, otherwise the other people got a problem with decisions being made without them having some say in the decision. That's the type of Budinsky people at the top that you'll bump into. They want their fingers in every pie. They want to know what's going on everywhere all the time, and they want to have their say so, or their cut, or something. Otherwise, they just want to trash it. So you get one of those, your country, like Lebanon, can go from really cool destination with a lot of culture, a lot of open spaces, without a lot of people, nice landscapes, and archaeologically significant different areas, to just burnt up war zone filled with scragglies. People that not only have chips on their shoulder, but are ready to take whatever you have, especially if they think you're someone that did something to them when you're just traveling through. They'll figure out a reason why you did it if you have something, type thing, type dynamic. So the other thing is that no matter how smart or capable or honorable or brilliant and magnificent one is, one person, one nation can't solve every dang problem that the world can throw at it. But it has to make the best decision for whatever polity that it is responsible for. seems it's bewildering to have to state the obvious, but in this day and age, nothing's obvious. There's a lot of smoke machines, big high-tech industrial smoke machines. Just think of those big newspaper printers times 1,000 or 200,000 or something like that going all the time. Disinformation. So how can these things happen? That's one way, in a pretty big way too. So who's the management? Who's the owners? What did they produce? During what amount of time? When and where? What were the results? 10 years in prison, that's it. Something like that. That would be a beginning. A beginning before an end that is foreseeable, that isn't in anyone's interest except the most vile of enemies. As a scientist of the human animal, it's always nice to take notes, abstract notes about places in far off places without having any horse in the race. Imagine that you're someone who goes to the horse races, but you don't have any horse in the race, you don't have any bet, and you're not looking to take ownership shares away from the proprietors of the establishment. But because one has been to so many different horse races around the world, you get sort of a feeling for the milieu, to put it one way. So you see you don't just take it at face value like a rube from the farm. You start seeing the people, the jockeys, you start seeing egregious forms of cheating. The longer you live, the more you see. But if you're not placing bets on horses, what do you care? It's just curiosity, isn't it? A passing curiosity. So as far as the so-called authoritarian regimes, what are these? Let's break it down. Let's break down the complexity, as they say. So again, how many families are we talking about here? 100 families? Maybe that's way too much. Could be 50, less. 5, something like that, maybe. Who knows? Each horse race, each country is different. So I'm not saying that this has happened in all countries, but this is something that can happen in all countries. And then, so guess what? They're little proxies they send in to be the politicians, basically glorified lawyers that have marching orders, like do this, make this happen, that type of thing, pure impunity type thing. They need to remain to be seen as reasonably popular. So if that is not the case, like in the case of Saddam Hussein, that's a great one, then you need to manufacture it by putting the supreme leader in a fashionable light at all times. But of course, what worked in the past with peasants doesn't really work in modern times, so they need to adapt the believability machine. So at the same time, they have to discourage real citizens of real aptitude, talent, and morals, and good sense and values. They need to dissuade them from going into politics because it's covered. The bases are covered there. They've got the bases covered. And they're not looking for new ideas. If there's new ideas out there, they'll try to just steal them. Like, oh, that's a great idea. I think I'll do that. Let me take 100 million out and make that dream of yours happen. Now, of course, it's a shabby duplicate, but that doesn't really matter. They think it's better the way they decide things, and they decide things because they're affiliated with some family that's in the political rackets that has no business being in it, other than that they had the impunity to decide to do it and did, and somehow got away with it for all this time. But let's not forget how far they will take this ruse. So they will take this ruse to the point where they fabricate and propagate the myth that they are the people and the nation. They represent that. They have to represent that. If they're not seen to represent that, well, then they're not legitimate, are they? So the more they're seen to be that, but guess what that is? That's a sleight of hand. That's a co-option. These people don't represent the damn countries they're robbing, that they're barricading themselves into. They have a lot of money to make themselves seem pretty smart and pretty capable and pretty professional, but their whole business is ripping the country off and just maybe attending to a few things that might make them feel a little self-important and involved in some way in the country that requires a lot better leadership than they're capable of producing. Specifically strategically, which is the most important of all. They're absolute dunces on that level, which leads to a tremendous atrophying of complicated systems that they never understood in the first place, never will understand, don't even want to understand. They don't care. Their whole table's filled with sirloin. Just imagine that. They took a whole cow, chopped it up in little pieces, and they throw that daily on their table every day. They might take a little piece of it, throw the rest away, or they divide it up with their cronies like that. Whoever's pulling guard duty gets to me, take some home and distribute it. But of course, if those stories get out that there's that much waste, that could be a problem for them too. So just imagine the type of paranoia these people live into, so they don't have any problems throwing somebody into prison for 7 years for drawing a cartoon that wasn't in line with their narrative totality. And these people have narrative totalities. Just think of the amount of money in oil wells or oil wells provide you, and that's just one industry. Just imagine how many rackets they're running. So you want to talk, you need money for something, they got enough money. But see, money doesn't solve the problem of culture or reciprocity, does it? So they're victims of their own success. They're victims of greed. They're the dupes, the dupe of dupes. It's the curse of the Midas touch. That everything they touch turns to gold. Well, what does that mean? The world turns to stone. Their society's a trophy. Because the first principles are wrong of the people that are in charge of the place. The owners and managers of the restaurant is crazy. The food doesn't taste good after a while. People start getting sick and dying. How about this? They stop serving food, but they force you to go to the restaurant, force you to go through the motions. Imagine that. You could do a whole film, like maybe a short experimental film, where people go into a diner because they have to, but they don't get anything except maybe berated or trolled while they're there. That would be a simile, an equivalent, a parallel, in a funnier way to the very serious way they do it. But don't forget, they're the people. They represent the people. They're the institution. Like Louis XVI, I am France. That's sort of their mentality. Like Louis XVI said it because he believed it, okay? And these people believe it too. And why shouldn't have Louis XVI have thought that? And yet, was it true? What if Louis XVI decided he wanted less people telling him what to do, and so he just decided to bring in a bunch of Berbers to just surround his walled palatial estates, just because they were less talkative or less coherent than whatever was there before. The thing about kings, and God knows there's been incompetent kings, the whole historical landscape is riddled with them. The tombs are full of them. But the kings had ministers. Ministers were usually at least people that had some sense of responsibility for the franchise they were monitoring. Not just monitoring, managing. How about that? Managing, yes. This is a restaurant. The food needs to be on point. Hygiene needs to be on point. The staff needs to be on point. The electricity needs to be on point. Like, all the way down the line. And then you've got happy customers. You've got satisfied customers. You got customers that just don't want to leave. You got customers trying to get in, but people aren't letting them in type of situation. Now again, it's the manager that's doing it for the love of doing it the right way. Is he getting adequately compensated? That's not really the question to ask. He needs to know. He needs to make it happen. Even if he's not, because he knows this isn't a perfect world. And it's very understandable why and how bad things happen. And they happen all the damn time. And yet still, that has to be something that is built into effective management, which is to say, even under the worst conditions, what do? And that might also mean closing up shop or restarting, relocating, downsizing, whatever it needs to be, whatever is the right decision in the moment. That's the one that should be pursued for the benefit of the many, not of the few. As far as being helpful and compassionate with the true Russian people, which at this point is the true Russian opposition, let me throw out a couple of things right there. Yeah, guess what? Who are good Russians? Good Russians are patriotic. Absolutely. Russians have a lot to contribute to Central Europe. But of course, if you take patriotism too far, it becomes a liability. Super patriots, they are not, they are like the ultimate trolls of patriots. Patriotic people do not have to treat other people poorly. In fact, due to their richness, they can be generous with other people. But that also doesn't mean overly generous. You're not going to let in just any old people to a place. So the Russians that think that way, there's nothing wrong with them. Absolutely nothing. In fact, there's a lot right with them. In fact, the West can learn a whole lot from them in a lot of different ways. Especially how to maintain certain conservative values. So this is where, again, the opposition does not need to go the crazy Western route, which I've already said is probably a crazy Russian route, because the current management of Russia paid for that. Oh yeah, it's their money that paid for that. Paid for the boogeyman that everyone's running away from, but they have no better solution than throwing innocent people into jail for perpetuity under unspeakable conditions. So, is that the opposition that isn't in opposition, that won't admit that that's happening and needs to be fundamentally, absolutely, and unequivocally changed on every level? In fact, just build a new building. Uh, don't even take the walls of the old buildings. Well, okay, guess what? I can say that and it can be true, and it can be the future of Russia, which is a good one. A nice place to live, full of people who aren't filled with a bunch of cockamamie ideas that aren't true. Historical fabrications. There should be I would like to say a crime against doing it, but that's a law that would be misused too quickly. But there does need to be more academicians that care a little bit more about historical accuracy and less about political flame throwing or private interests or moral grandstanding or whatever it is that people do with history that leads to these horrendous abuses of teaching people the wrong things or the wrong takeaways of historical occurrences. That is just unbelievable in terms of how bad that is. Which is why that brings me also back to free press. Everyone thinks, oh yeah, if people talk, then the other side hears you and then they make it worse. Well, that's sort of what happened. Yeah, that's what they're doing now. But because they have nothing to offer anyway, except more of the same of the direction they're heading, why not talk freely? You know, if you're in the gallows anyway, in the peanut gallery, out in the cold because they got the doors locked, why not? Still got some fresh air outdoors. Might as well just describe the thing as it is, not in some terms that suit people that have driven the country into the ground. Really, if we take 95% of the people in the country and just look at how they're living, yeah, they have done that to them. So it doesn't matter how spectacularly handsome the oligarchic class or the crumb class of the oligarchs eating the crumbs off their table. It doesn't matter how fantastically fly they are. Had that money been invested in the 95% of Russia, and just a drop of that money in good places, which much of the country is, when it's not being mismanaged, you would have a million times the return on that investment. Minimum. But no, these handsome, talented people that ran away with the money, they're living charmed lives, and everyone else is living not much above just common livestock and treated in the same way. So now, as a historian, this is really fascinating to witness in the modern age, because we have this linear type of thinking that, well, the West got serfdom behind it. But we need to realize that the Soviet Union reinvented serfdom. And its results were a catastrophe. A cultural catastrophe, a economic catastrophe, but firstly a cultural catastrophe, of which politics is one of them. Shut down the forum. Let's go back to the forum. The forum was a place guys could come and hang out and they could discuss ideas. Now, fights broke out. There were, different crimes at different times committed by people with similar tendencies that we see today. But in a time where the forum was free but also possibly curated, because not everyone went there, quite understandably so, that we consider that today, and rightfully so, as a time of cultural flourishing and advancement as far as insight goes into the human condition, as well as political and philosophic architecture. Now, there were some good years, some good decades, some good centuries, and then barbarism. But this is barbarism outside of anyone's control. There's no master of this universe necessarily on this earthly plane that can be so perfect in their decision making and their vision of whatever it is that they're envisioning at the moment, that they can never make mistakes. But by talking to other people, sometimes you can come to the best conclusion if you're talking to wise people who have the interest of the community, the nation as a whole, as their primary preoccupation and not necessarily their own benefit. Where the cynic would say that's impossible, actually, no, it is possible. Even if it's rare, it is possible. History records such people, and it records how rare they are, but it's also rare to be experiencing times such as these where the least enlightened people have so much disproportionate power to do harm, which is what they do, even if they don't think they're doing it. But this whole parasiticism that they're involved in sets that causality in motion because it's the first wrong move that they made. Nothing after that can make up for it. But even if you don't want to see it that way, you could just say that the fraud that they're perpetrating on the community is a multitude higher than the profits they gain thereby. And so they're fool's gold miners. All of the work, all of the effort they put into maintaining their regime is just an effort to accumulate mounds and mounds of fool's gold when the time could be spent extracting the real stuff instead. One observation that just came to me was thinking of the politicians that are just proxies for interests that do not represent popular issues. Think of them as like about the ability, having about the acting ability and competency, professionalism, and morals as an offshore accounting agency that dresses its employees up in fancy clothes and gives them things to say in front of a teleprompter, and will take care of that service for you for a fee of X, Y, and Z as a consultancy company. You don't think any of them, those outfits, never decided to upgrade into that lucrative business of proxy representation? It's just a different level of it. So the popular population runs to these people with like problems or recommendations, and they're just softballing in front of the camera for their stint. Their contract expires. And then they'll be on to the next thing. Like they might be promoting charities, or they got a whole different set of things they'll be doing. Maybe giving speeches in front of universities, because, ex-prime minister or something coming to town, going to tell you how to sell out to the highest bidder, something like that. Convey those values to a new classist system that involves a social totality, which involves a lot of ideological framing and a lot of self-supremacy type wafting of fumes that you can afford if you're in the class of people getting paid to do that. But if you're not, you're the have-nots. So the have-nots are going to want to have what the haves have, but the haves, to have the haves, have to compromise with the regime of people that are not working in the public interest. Now, if you're a foreigner, or perhaps even despise the franchise that you're representing, that makes that job, that shakedown operation, all that easier, doesn't it? So you wouldn't really find people from the ranks unless they're really subnormal in a lot of regards. Perhaps, again, they're nihilists. Of 1,000 people, let's say you find the one nihilist that will do anything for money, and that job doesn't seem much worse than the other jobs out there, which are much worse. Have you ever hosed out a cement truck? Well, that's where these people would be if they didn't shimmy shammy in front of the camera as a political operative. So have things degraded that far? Of course they have. So they have in the West in many areas. So that's where they're talking about authoritarianism. I don't think that definition really covers that dynamic. You need to look more into the phenomenon of the Dutch disease and then start digging a little deeper. What does they say that then the economy shifts to just a service economy when these people start monopolizing things, but it's a lot more bleak than that. And so it's more or less trading money for influence. That's another way to look at it. You don't have to think about this as just completely down and dirty business. People that want to exchange money for power, that's the people that are very much involved in political practices for nefarious reasons. So it's not just identifying them who don't necessarily make themselves public, but understanding who's working for who is a pre-political process. Now you would hope the people involved would be there for the benefit of everyone, but as I described, the trajectory of decline means that, and especially if a country has become impoverished, that the people who want things, the greedy people, are the ones that rush the government institutions, the government trough. They rush it like some type of bacteria or some type of rabid dog. Because if you're greedy, just imagine being hungry. See, hunger is a form of greed. Now, when we're satiated but we're still hungry, that's when people say we're greedy. But it's sort of the same thing, craving something. So, but just because people crave something doesn't mean they should get it, or if they get it, it's going to be beneficial for other people. It's not. Especially when these people think it is zero-sum, and in some cases it is. All the wolves jump on the carcass, start ripping it apart type thing. They got to put their snout in the furthest, the fastest. Like hyenas also. You should watch them rip a corpse apart. That's sort of the dynamic that these greedy people are involved in. Or vultures. That's something people use. These people are vultures, yeah. They don't see it that way though. Not in the human dimension, not in the political dimension. They will self-rationalize everything that they do. And that also includes, oh, well, let me just explain it this way that's innocuous instead of the real way. And enforcing an alternative reality that makes their way the right way and your way the highway, the citizens of the country. It's, of course, yeah, supposed to be in the interest of the people of the country, but look closer, you'll see that that dynamic isn't happening in a lot of places. And so, why don't we just call that declineism or putrescence, or a decay and downfall of civic institutions? Why not just call it that and the process associated with it and the people and personalities that are key players in it? And in that way, you can shine a light on all civilizational decline all around the world and everyone involved in it, in its modern iteration and in times gone by. And yet, be that as it may, none of us need to succumb to it. You get a diagnosis that you have cancer, that's terrible, but if you have access to the best medicine, you can cure yourself. And it should be in everyone's interest that this medicine gets manufactured and distributed, because the patient will survive. And to create an image of that process taking place, imagine that there's a whole house where people are crying, everyone's sad, everyone's in a bad mood, everyone's dejected. And why is that? Because a loved member of the family has been declared as having an incurable disease. And then appears out of nowhere a doctor, very well dressed, well put together, well meaning doctor. Out of the cold blizzard, he appears like an apparition. And he asks, "What's the problem?" And everyone tells him, "Oh, this person's going to die. They've been suffering. They can't sleep, they can't eat. They can't do this, they can't do that. They're in deliriums. They scream out in pain. They've gone blind." And the doctor goes in, he diagnoses, he checks the pulse, he looks at different things, he looks at the signs, he lifts a leg. And then the suspense grows. Everyone wants to hear, well, what's the verdict? The doctor says, this patient can be cured. Just imagine that. That's the verdict. So bad government can be cured. That's the good news. It absolutely can. Just like a bad disease, it could be cured. They would not take appropriate action, that they would just continue the heist despite the brewing storm. Would you expect such people to change their tune, to find some a reason for doing the right thing when they started off in the wrong way from the get-go? So it all seems so impossible to understand until you see them for what they are. That's what they're doing. Like, they can say they're politicians, but their actions define them. See, I have a different. There's a different common understanding of what a politician is, and they don't share that. They're just affixing the label to a money laundering operation. So if you need to think of it in another way, in modern terms, it's a social hack. The safe cracker didn't have to break out any blowtorches or nothing. So how did these people get 150 billion pounds? Well, hey, you know what? I'm really concerned about politics and have been for a long time, and I really do care about doing the best for this country, but the fact that I'm allowing 150 billion pounds to illicitly be laundered speaks more towards the fact that they're flagrant cons. So the UK now is in a bad way. So the Conservative Party that ran on a phony platform and now has been exposed over time, because that's what happens with cons in a public forum where people ostensibly should have a say in how their government is managed in free Western societies. At least that's one of the gigantic myths that are still propagated. They're exposed, but because they won the election fair and square. They won it fair and square, sure they did. Maybe they even pumped some of that 150 billion pounds into a gigantic public relations campaign. Something like that. Would that be an illicit way of manipulating voter outcome or vote outcome? Yes or no? If so, is that not also something that can be added to the list of condemnation that they have accrued? So, but, there was an election, so no, they have their term now that they've been completely exposed as utter frauds and criminals, more or less. Because, how about this? They won't even ensure basic security. They won't even enforce the law when it comes to just people showing up on their borders. That's organized by modern day slave operations. People call it human trafficking. That's a euphemism. It's slavery. It's slavery as old as the hills. It's a slave operation with modern characteristics. That's it. Involved in open slavery, slaving on a global scale. They will not enforce the law, although that is the law on the books. They refuse to do it. But because they won the election, it's legal for these illicit operators to not call for a general election, just serve out their term. So the UK is looking at 12 months of total dysfunction and robbery, because they need the time to launder 150 billion pounds, of course. Like, they're not looking to speed that process up or to slow it down or to abruptly end that process based on what? Their reputation being totally demolished in the public forum. They don't care about that. Well, what's the public forum? Next week, there'll be some other distraction, then it's on to the next boondoggle. They're hoping someone else does something even worse. And then where are they in the public mind? Well, it's back to business of laundering government funds. They have the big responsibility of making sure all those taxes that they're legally empowered to collect, that collection process keeps taking place, because otherwise they couldn't direct that 150 billion pounds to where they want that to go, which certainly isn't in defense, because why would they want to be making their job more difficult when chaos makes it a lot easier? So, all of this seems like very shocking, but if you are a cultural scientist and you have researched, for example, the Library of Alexandria or the Library of Ephesus, and the people and different things involved there, and then just finally the centuries of disaster afterwards, even up to this very day, it sort of isn't all that surprising. It isn't. But what wasn't really possible back in those days was a feedback culture. Information was scarce. And so they pulled off these heists in the dark. Whereas today, people although there's tremendous amounts of disinformation, which they're a big part of because that's an offshoot of the euphemistically termed public relations industry, which is propaganda, if you want to put it plainly, propaganda of bad ideas and a lot of lies, gigantic lies, in fact, then it all makes a lot more sense that we can, as cultural scientists, use modern examples of what is an old business, which is defrauding the government. It's defrauding governments and pretending to be acting in the public interest. And if we come back to and broaden the definition of political operators, it's not these grubby, scruffy, charlatan democratic variety, but it's also people that are born into wealth. They have a political responsibility whether they admit it to themselves or not. And if they have the ideology that's very convenient for them to think that the masses are always wrong, and the only way we can always be right if we make them always wrong, and so the more ludicrous the public forum is, the safer our positions are, and the more it confirms our misbelief in our own superiority, then you can have a whole bunch of people that were traditionally the leadership class that have advocated, that have, by association, by do-nothingism, that they are accomplices in the illicit enterprise. Because why should you make a differentiation between the straight out of the gutter variety that's polished themselves versus the ones that had every opportunity not to be a gutter denizen, but more or less is on board as far as the finances are concerned. So we can go back in history. I like looking back at queens and kings, for example. History has full of them. And in their day, you could not criticize them upon pain of death. Now we can look back and say, you know what, this king, he was a piece of crap. The country, the realm he was in charge of fell apart. And maybe it was a confluence of reasons. Maybe he had bad ministers. Maybe he had a bad upbringing. Maybe his mummy used to paddle him with a cricket bat. You name it, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, history judges them as incompetent or tyrannical or stupid or misguided. Now, if you can go from, how about queens too? Let's not forget. The English, they always like to point at the French Revolution, say, oh, look, that went all wrong and all of this. But Marie Antoinette and what they were doing and the people that they were allowing rob the country and mismanage it, that was ultimately their responsibility, and they failed. So it wasn't a failure of the French Revolution, it was a failure of the French aristocracy. And it wasn't because they didn't adopt the Russian mindset of treating slaves like slaves. It was that they just didn't solve basic problems because they were in relationships with people that had somehow leveraged some scam out for themselves that was more important than doing the right thing, which ultimately is cowardice. So there they are, dressed up with all their little medals and shiny bits of this and that, and baubles and wigs and you name it, and it's just a dressed up coward that's the front face for an illicit operation. So the French Revolution, okay, they got rid of them. They got rid of the Tsar. They got rid of Herod. Go back. Even Alexander the Great. What made him great? What was great about what he did and what wasn't? So as far as these political operators go, that if there's anyone called king or anybody called an aristocrat that allows these types of misguidances to take place during their lifetimes and they do nothing or just the most inconsequential of prattling about it, they're part of the problem. There's nothing valuable about them. That's not to say that the institution isn't valuable. The institution is priceless. But as far as the operators go, they're nothing valuable about them. They are misguided people. You want to make it even more neutral. It's a company. There's a CEO. The CEO stinks. Ergo, the culture in the company goes downhill. Ergo, things start breaking. Ergo, people get paid less. Ergo, sales fall off a cliff. Ergo. That's a bad CEO. That's a bad king. That's a bad whatever label you want to affix to it. And the consequences, they are real and they are not trivial. And so why should we care what they think about themselves or how they got to where they got? You're a crappy CEO. That's the title that history will give to you. So why shouldn't people in contemporary times come to this a more immediate conclusion and take more immediate steps to remedy the situation? When going over a few of the previous explorations, it's a good thing to edit some of the things you say and some of the things you want to say and then how you say them. You can put extras on things. For example, if you're angry and you don't realize you're angry, you can start embellishing things without realizing it. At the time you're doing it, you feel like it's important to communicate a sentiment in a certain way because you're agitated. But guess what comes out when you're agitated? Try to guess. Well, it's agitation. You become an agitation producer. And your agitation produces agitation that agitates other people. How about that? Do you see the causality? So imagine people stuck in subnormal states of agitation that are thereby transformed into carriers of agitation in a pathogenic way. That should seem simple to you now that you can see it, that there's causality. How it does good times produce good fortunes. It produces optimism. It produces a lot of good things. And so we can't look to the past and just see the negative things. Why do we look for the points of contention when we can look to the fantastic accomplishments? I keep coming back to dentistry. Dentistry is really something that all peoples can appreciate. Just think of all of the good things dentistry has done for you in your life. So for that reason alone, there's good commonality among men and women, and that's exactly what needs to be cultivated, despite how certain interested parties want to misconstrue whatever it doesn't like and apply some type of toxic poison frame to it, which not only has a big component of alternative reality and alternative reality propaganda and astroturf to it, which should be an indicator that it's not legitimate. But it's really misdirected based on emotions that one is saying is justified, but on what reasons? Well, they come up with a historical reason. But they weren't there, you weren't there, who knows? And we're already well beyond that, because every day is a new day. To resist the temptation to imbibe in hostilities by taking a hostile perspective on life, history, and any other thing that is agitatory, it's true, but it's not relevant or shouldn't be relevant, especially in a decision-making process that creates terrible results that are easily avoidable if one adopts a different point of view, a different worldview, which is not one that seeks out conflict, but rather eliminates the reasons for conflict in the first place by reforming not necessarily the self, but with the help of not self. See, there's another one. See, no self and not self, very close, but slightly different. I prefer now not self to no self, because the self keeps coming back. We have an awareness of self, but we have to use the supernormal perception of not self. So this is the self that's causing the agitation. So let's let it flicker it off for 1 second, then maybe make it 3 seconds, and see if some of the agitation falls away. And if you're able to do that, if you've discovered that button called not self, the perspective of not self, which is a real perspective, it's ultimate reality based on ultimate truth. Because otherwise, where is it? Where is it yourself? If you're a materialist, you must be able to produce the self, but you can't. But you keep pushing your expectation that in some day, in some future world, it will be possible to replicate a self. But the self itself, if you can replicate it, isn't a self. Because the self is, again, something that you can flick on and off and for your own benefit. Because how much of self is delusional? That's delusion. Self is a big part of delusion, big part. But if you can, it's really a conduit. It's the conduit of delusion in certain spiritual matters. For example, your agitation levels. You're really angry because somebody insulted you yesterday, right now. But right now is 10 years later. You don't think that's relevant as far as quality of life goes? If you can dispense with doing that, you can catch yourself doing that and stop yourself doing that. And you can do it without any type of medication or therapy or memberships at the gym or a whole lot of other things that don't usually work out right in the end, or end up costing a lot of money or having a lot of disappointment, disillusionment associated with it. Because that's part of the process of being disillusioned, is then you feel like you've lost something, but really you've lost the delusion. And it's normal to be delusional. It's normal to be peduginal. Goes round and round. Wake up in the morning, it's the same day as yesterday. For people trapped up in the importance of the appearance of the importance of the culmination of forms, sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and out of controlness and impermanence, change, variation. And so one can get beyond whatever petty injuries one was obsessing about, and one can reflect and see that no, that's not a better state of man to be focused on anything, be it the best things or pathologies. And yet, if one can have a choice to direct one's sight to the best things, then one can leave one's pathologies behind, and also pathological people or pathological principles or any old thing that is very agitatory at the end of the day. And yet, agitatory in a neutral way. You never want to attach with what is agitation personified, but rather detached in every way. And it is possible. In the beginning, you'll say it's not possible, but it's in fact a door that was there the whole time. That's very easy to walk through. The hinges don't squeak. It's smooth, floats. In fact, you can just lift your hand and the door just opens without you even having to touch it. And you enter a new world where this self that I just brought back from a reboot isn't disappointed about disappointment, isn't bothered about bothersome things, isn't focused on the aversionary or the beautiful, the desire or the aversion, either one, but rather in pure equilibrium, pure weightless, brilliant splendor. Coming down to earthly matters for a moment, dealing with bad people that don't want to listen is sort of the definition of what makes a bad person bad. Now think who you think is a bad person right now, and then just shift that to something else, like something you thought was a good person. Shift that view to them, and is this good person really good? Or maybe they think they're doing good and doing bad instead, type thing. So good and bad, you should definitely try to gain insight in what is good and what is bad. But the great thing about certain teachers is that many of them came to direct conclusions about what was the best price value trade-off as far as agitation. And they really went for the direct cut, like every mind moment. They got into the practice of that. And just like riding a bike in the beginning, very difficult, very complicated. In the middle and the end, it's smooth sailing. It's cool runnings. There's no thumping, there's no friction. You can just hear those bearings roll on light oil and infinite perfection. As far as others go, realize that every being is in some state of transformation, not just physical, but also spiritual. And some people are tending downwards or not mastering their passions and emotions and feelings. Hasn't everyone had days like that? You wake up on the wrong side of the bed. There is absolutely nothing that can be done that can change your mood. And then maybe it's not one day, it's 2 days, and then it's not 2 days, it's 4 days. But on the 5th day, something happens and completely changes your perspective on what had gotten you down in the dumps, which might have been some type of morose attachment, because the feeling was very real, and so it was a very real feeling, so it was a very compelling feeling, which was a very hindering feeling from letting things go, because you're not letting things like that go, you're holding on to them, when in fact they're just causing agitation. So these are dynamic processes, which is why it's preferable to be in a situation that allows for a lot of solitude, because you cannot go through that type of transformation process unless you give yourself the time and dedication that such a process requires. Now, it's possible that this process wouldn't have been so difficult if the conditioning wasn't in such a way that made it impossible to go through such a transformation that leads to a more enlightened state of mind, and also a wiser point of view as far as worldly things are concerned, and the amassing of wealth at the great expense of many great people that have gone unrecognized, to make this civilization as worthy as it was to me, and should be to you too. If you haven't seen it that way, change your perspective. We have a lot to be extremely grateful for. I know I am. If you're not feeling that right now, you're not looking in the right places. That's where you should be looking. That's where I look. If you cannot be dispassionate, you cannot have a humorous perspective, then you also are committed to one position, and that position is enmity. And that's really a losing position, because it doesn't win a lot of popular support, for good reason. Who wants to be around someone who's just, complaining all the time? Yet, if there's good reasons for why someone's complaining, nobody's listening, nothing's getting done about it. You can drop the topic too. Like, again, when was it ever a good thing to try to fix all of the problems of the world that aren't solvable? Not in this lifetime or the next, but try-hardism is never the right attitude to have. If you feel yourself getting worked up like that, it's because you have a problem on the aggression side of things. You have a problem on the agitation side of things. Like, why do we whip horses? You give the horse the whip, the horse, that activates the neurological system, it's the adrenaline, and that's why the horse springs to a gallop, and it'll stay galloping if it's still getting whipped. So you got to remove the whip that you're applying to yourself, because that's not the way to ride a horse, or to ride a chariot, or to be skillful in general. Now, rare instance, it might be required, but we're going to put that down to depending on what you're doing and why. And if you're using a lot of whip, why are you doing it? Is that really the best strategic place to be? Is that what has been known to be a predominant characteristic amongst places people want to be? Where you got whips flying hither and thither on man and beast. So for some reason, that became sort of the norm. They're like, yeah, giving yourself the whip, that's what you need to do as a successful person. So, you can hear a lot of funny things, and you can implement a lot of bad policy, and you can get a lot of bad results, but you can also stop doing that, which is a policy in and of itself. You stop, or attempt to stop, or figure out a way to stop doing that. in several different iterations, perhaps even more than that, to finally bug out of a hangman's noose, some type of fatal logical fallacy based on variables that one is not skillfully employing. I love introducing zero into complicated mathematical equations, and then timesing it by that. So however complicated the thing is, times it by zero, what do you get? That's right, all that complexity goes to zero. So tryhardism, use it as an indication. Like, where is this coming from, this tryhardism, and how is it leading me possibly in the wrong direction? And the more I can get that under control, the better, which might also mean putting up with a lot less effort and a lot less rewards, just slowing that circle down. And it was just the other day I was treating a jacket that I wear when it's raining, and where I am now, it rains all the time. But there's such a thing called paraffin, which is a non-reactive, waxy substance that you can rub into cloth, and then if you heat it over a campfire, for example, it melts in and bonds to the fabric. And if you put it on a couple of layers of that till the garment is almost crusty, or if that much heavier because it's now been dispersed in a unison way throughout the jacket, it's impervious to water. It's more or less sealed like a wax candle. You can throw it in the ocean and it's not gonna interact with water. Water, which is a great thing, by the way, wonderful material. All of its properties are magical. But when you have one of those jackets on and it's raining, you can walk under a waterfall and not a drop gets through. So think of that as a good application of practice under variable conditions. I have to really be aware of not being consumed by anger or rage when I say or report the number of the deaths in this year to just one chemical substance, and that's 800,000 deaths in the United States to date. 800,000 people. And this happened during the overwatch of public representatives. Is that right? Well, what public are these representatives representing? Because apparently the 800,000 that no longer have a voice, they're no longer amongst us, they can't tell us what the problem is. But when 800,000 people die in the course of a year, we're in mid-November at this point, mid-November 2023. This is what was reported over the wires. Who bears responsibility for that? Who are the public constables that should be or are tasked with ensuring public order? Who are they? They could get hit immediately with a dereliction of duty charge. And they would have to prove that they were actually fulfilling their duties while that happened in order to beat the rap in a fair court presided over by the public's highest representatives, the most responsible valuable, generous people that a community has at any one given moment in time, the most authentic, that they decide whether there was a dereliction of duty or not during up to this very minute, those responsible for ensuring the public order. A great question to ask yourself as a well-meaning person is, even in times of political difficulty, can you abstract the difficulty away from making accusatory statements that provoke some type of response that is foreseeable based on the predisposition of the parties engaged in such behavior that warrants the criticism in the first place? So what is the practicality of remaining silent if everyone remains silent and no progress is made? So how about this wonderful project, which would be how to create the political infrastructure that incorporates the good things of the EU but gets rid of the bad things, so that we just look at the first attempt as a prototype, and the second prototype is then made, let's say, more legitimate in that it encourages more participation amongst people that are legitimately a part of whatever member European state that they belong to. And so that there's also just, let's say, a general sentiment of pan-Europeanism in a way that, oh yes, we can work together in ways that make a lot of sense without attacking each other, and coming to conclusions that are mutually beneficial, that do not require any type of military disputes that, of course, can get out of hand. Let's not forget World War One. Okay, everyone's focused on World War II. Why? There's been wars, thousands of wars. You know, the war that gets me the most is the Napoleonic Wars. Nobody talks about them. They were the precursor to all of these problems. You know, why would Germany and France fight each other? Well, yeah, Napoleonic Wars, that was the precursor. So did that whole business make a lot of sense, or did it not make a lot of sense? Or what were the results of World War One? A lot of people just will not go back to World War One. They won't look at the lessons learned. They will not abstract it beyond the personalities and just see that greed, ill will, and delusion are three extremely dangerous things to have in high levels. And so one way that the peoples of Europe can unite in a way that makes sense is allowing people that are sensible access into political decision making and responsibility, which is to say, casting wider nets for well-meaning people and keeping them in positions of authority as long as their feedback ratios are at acceptable limits. If someone is performing has a 10% approval rating, that person is not qualified for the job. Now, of course, all those types of metrics can be manipulated, so a system needs to be in place that in some way rates satisfaction with certain issues. And yet, you cannot just take any issues and use that as the norm. You need to use the right issues. so that you can responsibly design better systems that have a higher approval rating because you're engaging with the public, the ruled, so that you can mutually and beneficially create better results for the most amount of people with the least amount of interference by negative forces. Because ultimately, it makes no sense to be a political idealist if you do not take into account that this type of arrangement, where there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action in many cases, that it attracts a certain type of person that doesn't belong in political processes, namely the person who's in it for self-enrichment. And people snigger and people smirk and all of that until the whole thing falls apart. And then it's the people that end up with all the problems. Where's the money? The money's gone. The money's worthless. Electricity goes out. It's just, the more you have access to information about how things go down around the world, the more you can see it and ask yourself the question, did it have to happen that way? Why wouldn't non-barbarian people that have a whole lot in common, why can't we come to some type of agreements about common prosperity instead of common hostility? How do we repair differences and disputes between us effectively and consequentially instead of flaring up of discontent, which in effect is just a great mismanagement? Let's simplify things. People go to a restaurant, they come out, they say, hey, the food was great. They're not forced to say that. It's really a true assessment. 5 years later, only 1 in 10 say it's a good restaurant. Well, that's absolutely, it has, the only thing to do with it is management. Before there was effective management, after there wasn't. So breaking the feedback loop, and that's what megalomaniacs do. That's why bad results happen in human-oriented or dominated political systems where they can exert influence for self-enriching ways. Finally, you could say it's a development into a parasitic, terminally parasitic and defunct type of mismanagement. And it's sad and it's tragic and it's as old as time, this story. So there's the causality of it, and then there's the prevalence of it. And again, there's systems that can either curate so that it doesn't break out, or if it does break out, it's dealt with in an efficient, non-violent manner, or you get the other version where, again, in a war, when thuggery breaks out, it's not necessarily good when the worst thugs beat the not so competent thugs, but maybe the people with the better ideas contingent of the disagreement. And so just on the basis of an ideological dispute, you're going to throw away talented people that get mixed up in these weird social games that have terrible consequences that nobody could foresee because of bruised egos, because of fragility in power structures, because that are illegitimate, because they are mismanaged, but the people who are mismanaging it don't want to stop doing that, don't want to leave, don't want to rethink their life's meaning or trajectory or competency or responsibility towards the people they lorded over. So there needs to be a feedback system. It needs to be neutral, and it needs to be humane, and it needs to be focused on the right things at the right time, in the right way, and not just the authoritarian game. We take over security services, we leverage that into law, and we run the country into the ground type thing. That model is a known loser. So if you have that model, you need to switch it out and adopt a new model. Now, there's a potential prototype for EU2. This is not rocket science, people. Do you know how much more complicated it is to build a rocket? Let me tell you, it's extremely complicated, difficult to do it successfully. Management, it's not as complicated as that. Good management, it isn't. But it does need some extra layers of curation so that people don't make repetitive mistakes which have been identified to be associated with bad governance, such as the abuse of power or the inability to process data effectively. For example, if you don't know that your rear axle is glowing red because of a misalignment, but if you did know that, you could take the appropriate action. That not having vital connections between information and realities on the ground so that one can appropriately act, that is a potential fatal situation. It's extremely dangerous and irresponsible to drive without knowing critical data that is available but isn't being computed in such a way that makes the most sense for the most people in the most compassionate, humane, and yet uplifting and civilized way that we can possibly imagine at this time. And yet we take it as truth that a third prototype could be developed, or a 2.1, 2.2, 2.3 version, depending on the different challenges that arise over time. It's not as complicated as rocket science. It just requires direction, it requires refinement, and it requires the goodwill of good people across Europe and the entire Western and non-Western world. Because one thing is certain, if these questions are not resolved in a civilized way, well, we all know how it looks the other way, and there's no reason in the world we shouldn't give our best efforts to avoid bad outcomes amongst who should be friendly peoples. There was a recent questionnaire that asked the question, what do you think is more important? Or they asked this question, see, you have to watch what the polling people who are connected with these PR companies, what questions they're asking. Because they're trying to profile you in some way. And they don't really have good intentions. Their intention is to sabotage any native movements. This is again coming back to the Marxist ideology. These are so-called Marxist intellectuals. So where did they go in their social theories? They went to exploiting class divisions. So they made themselves the intellectual class of power grabbers and power substitutionists and imposters and charlatans. And the despotic class, they consider themselves intellectuals and humanitarians and globalists. Okay? There's a lot of crossover. See, this stuff went global. Back in the day when there wasn't communication, when there was a Cold War, these ideas were still injected into the West via clandestine and nefarious means. But if you want to take the sensationalist language off it, you could just see how they operate today. Were operating then in more primitive forms. So people who like to say that's a conspiracy, I encourage all historians to go back to non-politicized versions of the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. So yes, these people did exist there. They do exist today, and they're global. What does Spain have to do with the Soviet Union? Well, they had something to do with it. The International had something to do with that. So the International was active outside the borders of the Soviet Union, so which means inside your country with these classist divisions. So imagine that. We're going to make a class division, and we're going to find allies that are also, let's say, propped up in their positions due to a classist system. We're just going to include them, usurp them, muscle them into our group. So that's one of their first movers that they have, and if the general public is kept in the dark that, oh, these people don't exist, or they're just way over there, or, oh, the system broke down and now there's something new, which is the same thing with the similar people that have a rock solid ideological component and zealotry to them, which includes not just the use of violence, but its rationalization as being a good thing that ultimately empowers them and their own interests at the expense of the majority, which they consider that's a cynical trope. Of course it's not a majority opinion. Everything's a scam, just like them. So they're going to be the best scam there is, gosh darn it, and we're a class. So this division, let's just keep it 100. They are not nationalists. This is what makes them not nationalists. See, nationalists will give people that look and act like them the benefit of the doubt and perhaps try to help people very close to themselves for very intuitive and understandable reasons. Of course, you can take it to an extreme, but there can also be reasons that it's taken to an extreme that they don't want to acknowledge because it ends up kicking out their foreign franchise at some point, and so why would they ever do that? Their main enemy are true nationalists. Now, they'll take on a fake position. They'll come in as a nationalist, but their ideology is classist and it's Marxist. And it does justify their usurpation, at least in their own minds, and they're all lockstep and zealous about those first points. So the type of person who would adopt that in foreign countries or push that in foreign countries, that's sort of the real imperialism. And that's what they've done. But they call it anti-imperialism because it's the other guy's franchise that they're trying to replace with their franchise, which isn't imperialist. It's and then just fill in whatever propagandist can come up with, such as, oh, it's the true democracy. It's the socialist democracy. It's the humanitarian version of the horrible thing that was there before, but they got rid of all those people, so they're heroes of the people type thing. And then it's self-congratulation until they die type of a regime with no regime change under their carefully managed social utopias. That is the official narrative. And if you deviate from that, you go to jail as an enemy and are treated as such. Just like that. And it's a class decision. So they might look just like you in a nation like Yugoslavia, for example. But that was an artificial construction anyway, where they tried to fabricate a type of nationalism above and beyond the national groups that were actually there, that didn't want to live under a dictatorship, but they just pretended didn't exist because they had the power to suppress native constituents that cared enough about their own people to criticize regimes that weren't benefiting them, so that they attacked those people because they were their political enemies, class enemies, ideological enemies type thing. What crimes do you think they were able to get away with in that state of mind? What do you think? Like, do you think you have a number that's low, or do you think that number is much higher than anyone would have thought? So let's not forget that the ignorance, the programmatic ignorance that these ideologues have, creates gigantic blind spots you could drive trucks through, train cars full of dead bodies through, oceans of victims can be absorbed in their titanic, gigantic lies. Like, they're not ashamed of doing it. They think that's just part of doing business. Again, these are cynical, practical people in a way. So all of the dumb things that happened in the last century, they decided to adopt and flip for their own purposes because they're the ultimate vulgarians, ultimate power player people that don't care how they win and are willing to maintain stupefying dictatorships because they benefit and their entourage benefits, and that's it. It's a ruse, it's a smoke show that it's for everyone else. They like to put themselves to bed at night thinking that it is. It just isn't. So, but the narrative and the reality, or if they're able to impose their narrative, then they have an alternative reality. So that's how they see it. So don't ever forget the pseudo-intellectualism that these international rationalizers have. And the funny thing is look, there's a Russian expat community. I think they're really funny. A lot of them are really bizarre, especially when they learned English and thought there was some type of like cultural exchange going on between groups. But they're coming from like a place way out in the sticks, and yet they seem to think that they know what nationalism is, or Nazis are, or extreme right people are. They start employing jargonistic things, and then they'll present maybe 20 questions where you'll align with them on maybe 15 questions, but on 5 questions where they're axe grinding ideologically on essential social fundamentals, that's where there's no bumps in the road for them. Like, they have an ideological take about what it is to be a moral person. A moral person is someone who doesn't exclude other people that don't share the same values or heritage or any other practical considerations, because otherwise they wouldn't have an in. They wouldn't have a place at their hypothetical globalized role as hegemon producers, like cancerous seeds of a cancerous tumor can only enter if you have this pseudo-nationalism and colorblind societies. So, and they also like to make close focus on Europeans, that this is a European problem and it's been a problem and it's something that needs to go away. It's something that belongs to the barbaric past. But it's not. Go to the other races. Multiple different tribes in Africa. Multiple different tribes. The Zulus are nothing like the Tutsis, right? There's 1,000 different tribes. Most people are anthropological ignoramuses, but they play within that realm of ignoramusville. A lot of them come from places that don't have any races in them, but they know what the bad old days look like. But what days did they experience? When these people were not on cotton plantations, who, by the way, were run by classist type pricks that they are very close to in ideological terms. It's just that back then they were able to get away with that type of slavery only on dark complected people. But now they got Europeans added to the franchise. And they should all just get along in one big mass, divisory, hateful mass. Otherwise, something's wrong with them, with their morals. So it's really funny that at the base of all of that, these so-called phonies from the working class that have overcome their prejudices on paper, what they're really displaying is a massive, they're massively signaling a noble oblige. That's a luxury belief that they have. That's right there. It's showing the ideology that has to overcome the facts to be true, but you have to make it true by overcoming the facts on a moral basis, instead of just admitting that different people most likely want to do different things for themselves. And then a lot of different people all at the same time in the same place, that's a prerequisite for a fight breaking out. One that could have horrible consequences and unforeseen consequences for an unknown number of people. If this does end up kicking off a Third World War, and they go down in history as part of the problem, where do you think their morals will stand up? If only in some kangaroo courts or court historians' misrepresentation of what actually went down. Which helps us go back to, for example, the 20s, 1920s, and look, how did they historically cover the First World War? What were their explanations for that? And how much of it does hold up to intense scrutiny? Not just for facts, but for plausibility and politicization, which has been weaponized in our time in the form of memory wars, which are a subsection of the cultural wars, which are a subsection of war doctrine that can get somebody so riled up with misconceptions about the past that you could put a rifle in their hand, send them to the Ukrainian border, and they could just start shooting people in an organized way. Are the ideologues and explainers behind that dangerous people, misguided people? Or are those moral people? Are those patriotic people? Are those good Europeans? Or are those leveraged Mongolian Khanate directives? Are we talking about predatory parties claiming to be universalists? Could they go that far in misrepresenting themselves when they misrepresented themselves to the world since it all began in 1917 and before, where they had all these crazy ideas, untested, undelivered, that they were too caught up in their own fumes to admit were tremendous failures, that they want to revive that in the form of an alternative reality, when they ran the best country on earth off the rails and are now just trying to export it in different forms and different public relations manipulated ways to a new set of classist imbeciles that have deficits all over the place, where values and well-working reciprocal systems coincide. They're there taking up the space, capturing the venue, and shutting down people that object to what amounts to a horrendous social policy, socioeconomic political policies, possibly the worst Europe and the Western world have ever seen. And yet they're still going to pitch young people on these fashionable ideas that came out of nowhere, but boils down to the most aggressive astroturf the world has ever seen in a post-digital age. Where would you put them on the scale of humanitarianism? These really slick, cool people that understand all the downsides of Western imperialism when they're engaging in their own demented version of it. Because unlike the Western version, which wasn't as maniacal as they claim it is, because they're projecting their own sentiments into the other, which is a common trait these Malthusian actors have amongst them, is that it did raise up the places that they were and did impart better values and better ways of doing things to a certain extent. They did allow for a lot of progress that's being explained away as some type of maniacal intent. When in fact, if the truth be told, the West were way too soft. Came up with these soft ideas based on soft heads that has led to this horrible overreach by some of the most horrible people on the planet, the people who victimize altruistic people if they can get a chance, and to do it at scale. Oh, before you could just swim in the Med and the beaches were nice and everything else. Now you can't. You get blown up by a mine because you got paranoid, hateful people that have alternative history themselves into fighting trim and felt like that they should preemptively attack you for their own self-defense type thing. So, and then become surprised when people don't believe that type of justification for the acts that they commit, because they're not zealous enough in the progressive, neo-barbaric progressive, the way they've repackaged progressive enough as the people calling the shots for now. But you would think in democratic systems that being implausible over a long period of time would lead to discreditation and then finally removal and review of any policies that the misguided party or parties, including fake oppositionists, have instituted to the detriment of world civilization and good working order. So will they come like in the 20s and in the 50s and just try to rewrite how they misplayed their hand in this time? Very plausible. Very much to be expected by a bunch of people that don't care about the results of their decisions other than their profitability metrics, which is the only thing that interests them, despite them saying otherwise. So that's the extent of their magic trick. It's rhetorical flourishes and explanations and do-nothingism, or perhaps to do the opposite thing that they said they were going to do-ism. Like really sophisticated stuff But yeah, look very closely where people come from, what they say, what type of holes they have. Not the common ground you have with people like that, but where are the discrepancies in basic practical things that make all of their highfalutin status signaling, although they'll say they're not doing that because they're trying to sell themselves and their version of normalcy is normal, when in fact it's deficient. You need to look at them. What are they talking about again? What did they say about that? Something they don't know anything about? Wasn't ever a problem for them, so it shouldn't be a problem for anyone because their environmental conditions didn't have any part of those problems. But they have a big opinion on why it's a problem that everyone's gotten past, when in fact it's a consistent problem that's pretty obvious, that they should have such a gaping hole in their ideological matrix just where they shouldn't have any gaps on a fundamental level. That's someone who, has been trapped in misinformation, has been agitated on certain issues, and have been manipulated into taking the faux positions. But they're faux only in the sense that they're rhetorical, but they're very real in the sense that they signal common ground with delusional zealots. So be sensitive about those things. There's not a lot of mistakes you can make in the political arena that you can claim is a mistake if you take a specific position, which is akin to overlooking the most basic things. So keep it in mind, these political operators, you got young ones, old ones, everything in between. You got the fancy haircut crowd and the not so fancy haircut. The tattoo and hipster crowd. So it really is just a level of how degraded you can be, and the flavors of it. But imagine that, a group of miscreants like that get together as a new classist group of prigs to obstruct you from institutions they would like to fill with cronies of their own kind. The only price that you have to pay, integrity, good sense, good causality. But if you're all in on self-enrichment, you'll find common ground with the lowest of the low. But why would you want to go there? Well, because they misrepresent their positions. But don't overlook the details. This is not a game. It's not preferences. This is really about the future of this world as we know it.